All right, so here we go again, video two. The king that's obviously the most important is Louis the 14th. And remember, we're just doing the big picture here in this lecture. We're going to go much more detail later on. His famous quote is, however you say that in French, I am the state. And his guy that backs him up is that Bishop Bossuet. Make sure you link these two together. Good SAQ question. If I mention Louis the 14th tomorrow and I say, tell me as much as you can about Louis the 14th, I say tomorrow, Saturday or Friday, whenever we do the SAQs on this lecture here, you want to associate those two. And he was justified by the divine right of kings. He was known as the Sun King. Apparently, he was in a play when he was a young boy and he played the sun, and that kind of stuck. There's some quote in Latin, but the English translation of it is one king, one law, one faith. And his palace was Versailles, and it was, I want you to make sure you're writing this down in your notes. It was called the Royal Theme Park of Absolutism. And he forced, and I'm going to give you a lot here that's not in the PowerPoint, so hopefully you're writing this down. Somebody said that he required the nobles to live there a certain chunk of the year, and that was called the intendant system. They sent people out. That's a Richelieu thing, which we'll do when we do the individual lectures later on. But he required the nobles to live there, and it was basically like a big soap opera. He basically dominated them and kept them in their place. And they claimed that it was his power was so absolute, he would pick who sat next to him at the dinner table. And if he wanted to use the balance of power concept, which he did in personal relations, he was trying to weaken somebody, he'd move them down a seat and move their enemy or their competitor up a seat. Also, you need to know about this sword versus robe nobles. Again, a pretty good example of something I could use for an SAQ. There were basically where nobility used to come from. If you saved the king's butt in a war, he would, make you get on your knees, and he would, crown you. That is a sword noble, someone who got their nobility because of fighting. And he would say, I crown you Duke of Zelwood. Robe nobility is someone who became a noble because they worked for the king. They might be a judge. They might be what we would call a senator. They didn't have senators in France. But a robe noble was like a judicial appointment. He would make them a judge somewhere. So make sure you know the difference between these two. There, as I've told you in the past, AP European has had many, many unique DBQs, and one of them once was on the differences between the sword versus the robe nobility. So it's been a pretty big topic in the past. Moving on to the next slide. Their big thing was mercantilism. And when you're talking about France, I'm not sure if these guys are not all contemporaries. They didn't necessarily live and rule at the same time. The guy you want to know about is Colbert, Colbert, Colbert. You see the name there on the slide. And his big thing was France. And Colbert was more than that. Colbert put in strict business rules with industries. When it comes to business and capitalism, and obviously a lot of people would say this is not capitalism, but in my opinion, it is. He set strict industry control standards. He was pretty dominant, kind of like this guy now for Trump, Mnuchin has been. Mnuchin is very, very powerful right now in the economic recovery of the country, assuming we can economically recover. Anyway, bullionism, remember the idea that you want the precious metal flooding in. Apparently, Louis the 14th kept France at war the vast majority of the time he was alive. They were very long, expensive wars, and he didn't win all of them. He also had a large standing army, and he had some military successes and some defeats, but he put his country through a lot of economic distress. There was bankruptcy and debt. The most famous war, which we're going to go over again at some point, that he was involved in was the War of the Austrian Succession. And that ended with the Treaty of Utrecht, sometimes called the Peace of Utrecht. So there's two of these wars, the War of the, I'm sorry, I messed up. Not the War of the Austrian Succession, the War of the Spanish Succession. The Austrian Succession, that's going to be Frederick the Great, we'll talk about later. This is the War of the Spanish Succession, where his grandson, there was some rule that there wasn't supposed to be a Bourbon on a Habsburg throne. And what happened was somebody died, and the next person in line to be king was Louis the 14th's grandson, which would have been a violation of this law. I don't know what the name of the law was. And Louis told his grandson basically to take it. And there's a big war because people obviously were very concerned that Louis the 14th was not only going to dominate France, he was going to dominate Spain, which was a Habsburg dominion. Remember, there's this competition between the Bourbons and the Habsburgs. Moving on. All right, so here is the differences between the Western and the Eastern absolutist. And again, I may give you an SAQ on this. And you won't have to know every single one, but you'll need to know some of them. And here's one. The Western nobles in countries that were really absolutist, like France, is pretty much the really only example. The nobility was limited by the king with the so-called intendant system in France. In Eastern Europe, now Peter the Great's going to have trouble with his nobles called the boyars. Remember, he's going to cut their beards and all that kind of stuff. But the nobles were very, very powerful, way more powerful than they were in the West. And remember, things are always worse in the East than they are in the West. If you ever see a question on that, they're just not as well off. They're still not as well off. But the nobles in Eastern Europe were very, very powerful, and it was very hard for a monarch to deal with them. The middle class in Western Europe was strong. That's the burghers. That is the nouveau rich, the gentry. That's there's several phrases here. This is the middle class. These are like doctors and lawyers. They were pretty strong. Remember, they're going to play a major role in the French Revolution. In Eastern Europe, those people were weak. The peasants in Western Europe, which are generally known as, well, just the peasants. Sometimes they call them the serfs. They were free. In Eastern Europe, they were serfs, which are basically one or two steps up above being a slave. Now, what was the deal here about Eastern absolutism? There was always, war, and they were always worried about the Asian invaders. The Russians were worried about the Ottomans. We'll talk more about this later on. And the power of the nobility went down, but their power of the peasants went up. By the way, I want to say something about that. In Eastern Europe, especially Russia, here's what the czars would do. They needed their nobles because their nobles had all this, local authority. And so what they did was to get their nobles to back them up. All right, now, so we're talking about the Russian czar. For the Russian czar to get his nobles to back him up, he gave them more power. Who did they need power over? Their own peasants. So the peasants had very few rights, the serfs in Eastern Europe, because those rights were over them were given to their nobles. The king did that to bolster his power. That's an excellent SAQ question right there. Permanent taxes without consent, and they had standing armies run by their nobles. All right, so now, again, you might want to pause it and write all this down. In Prussia, good. Whoever wrote this lecture, I obviously swiped this one, and I'm adding my stuff to it and taking stuff out. But they said what I said earlier, the Hohenzollerns are starting to dominate Prussia now. Most of them are named Frederick. And I've told you that story many times about how I used to do reviews on what the kids asked me to review. And I might do that with you guys this year. The week before the exam, I might say, what do you feel weakest on? And I'll do a review on that. But the Fredericks are in Prussia because I did a whole review once on the Fredericks. The Prussians, obviously, later on, they're going to be called a, what is this phrase? An army that needed a state instead of a state that needed an army. It's something similar to that. Strong military, strong trade and industry. They were religiously tolerant. Frederick the Great was pretty tolerant, and so was Joseph II, who's actually in Austria. But Frederick the Great was pretty tolerant. Remember, Voltaire lived in his castle there for a while. There was a trade-off with the Junkers. Now, the Junkers, Prussia is considered more Eastern than Western. It's what we call Germany now, but it's the Eastern part. And their landed nobility, this would be a good SAQ for you. What were the Junkers? Who were they? They were the Prussian landed nobility, meaning they're Prussians that owned a bunch of land and they had serfs. And basically what they did there is what we talked about in the last slide, is the Junkers were all powerful over their serfs. And so there was, it was a trade-off, and that's what this means. They gave the Junkers more political power, And the most famous junker probably in the history of Prussia is going to be Bismarck himself. He's from that class. All right, so we're going to skip over now to Austria. That's the Habsburgs, and they were weaker than they were. And there's lots of jokes about how the Habsburgs all married their cousins, and several of them were mentally defective. They had birth defects because of the intermarriage. A lot of jokes. I'm actually not sure that they're jokes. It is not a national state. It's a whole diverse collection of territories. Remember, later on, it's going to be part of this thing called Austria-Hungary, and it's going to fall apart, in World War I because there's so many different nationalities there. There's their leaders there: Leopold the First, Charles the Sixth, and here's the biggest dog on the porch, Maria Theresa. She is the Empress of Austria, and her father had wanted to make sure that she could inherit his throne, so he issued this thing called the Pragmatic Sanction. You want to know what that is? And the other rulers agreed to it. The Pragmatic Sanction said that the Austrian Empire would always be dominated by a Habsburg, and he changed the rules so that it could be passed to a girl, a female, and so he did that. So Maria Theresa. Now this is Joseph II, one of the famous enlightened absolutists. This is his mother. And so anyway, what's going to start the War of the Austrian Succession is the emperor is going to die when Maria Theresa takes over. Frederick the Great from neighboring Prussia, who is a Hohenzollern, and he's also an enlightened monarch, supposedly, is going to launch a war because he wants this place called Silesia. It's imperialism. Anyway, make sure you know what the Pragmatic Sanction is. It is a rule or principle or something, a meeting. I'm not even sure what it was. It was an understanding that the Emperor of Austria could be a female. All right, moving over to Russia. Here we go. Here's the big dog himself, the Romanov, Peter the Great, and he tried to westernize Russia. I did a lot on him, and I will do more on him later on as we get done with these big lectures. And he modernized it. He had to deal with the Streltsy. These were the palace guards, the Eastern Orthodox Church, and the boyars were the nobles. His big obsession was a warm water port. And remember, Tom Ritchie's recording studio, it's a joke, he calls them Warm Water Records because he is such a big fan of Peter the Great. And we will be watching Ritchie videos as well later on. He built up their army, but he's very famous for being the father of the Russian Navy. Next slide. Constitutionalism, the Polish monarchy is weak. And here's something you write down: the Polish monarchy, for them to pass a law, their legislature, the Sejm or the Diet there, the vote had to be unanimous. And this was what was on the test a few years ago, is that it had to be unanimous. And it was very rare you could get a unanimous vote. The Dutch Republic, now we're going to be talking about this a little bit later on, the Dutch revolt versus Spain. That was where, remember, Spain is controlled by the Habsburgs, and you had Charles V. He was the guy that was in the Luther film. His son is Philip II of Spain, and above France is what they call the Netherlands, which is now made up of two countries. That old part is now called Belgium and the Netherlands. And what happened was they revolted against the Spanish because a lot of it was religion. They wanted to be, they were Calvinist up there. And anyway, the stadtholder were these Dutch political leaders. They were religiously tolerant. People started moving to the cities. It was a socially mobile country. You're going to find that England and the Netherlands both were socially mobile, which meant they were more open to constitutionalism because there wasn't such a hierarchy of the nobility. There were nobles in these countries, but there wasn't such a hierarchy. It became a commercial empire. We're going to talk about that. Double entry bookkeeping, stock markets. They specialize in trade and finance and agriculture. And what's going to happen is there's going to be a decline because they have wars with England and France. And that is going to cause the Dutch Republic to decline. Anyway, I'm going to pause this second half right here. And this is going to be part 2.